And we're looking tonight at a story that is in each of the Gospels. So Matthew 14, or John chapter 6, or Mark chapter 6, or Luke chapter 9. It's the only miracle, apart from the resurrection, that is in every single Gospel. Which I believe probably means it's pretty important and pretty significant. But when you look at it, you think maybe it's not the most significant thing, but there's probably something that is kind of cool within it that maybe God wants to speak to us tonight about, and it's feeding the 5,000. And it's a story that I'm sure the majority of you would have heard a few times. And some of you may have even got confused before, because you may have looked in Matthew chapter, or Mark chapter 6, and seen Jesus feeding the 5,000. And then you've gone to Mark chapter 8, and you've been like, oh, Jesus now feeds 4,000. And still the disciples don't get it. Basically because it's the first one is with Jews, the second one was Gentiles. The disciples didn't understand that Jesus would do it for both sets of people. But so we have this, and you might even have read in the Old Testament, 2 Kings chapter 4. We're not going to read it now, but right at the end of 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a story that basically mirrors the feeding of the 5,000, where God provides for people. But we're looking in Matthew 14 today, and I'm just going to read it, and then we'll kind of discover some bits today. So Matthew 14, verse 13. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. As I said, probably a story that most of you would have heard before. I'm just going to come down because Nat's blinded me. That you may have heard before. And so it's this scenario where Jesus is with his disciples, and there's a large crowd that are gathering. Now, depending on which gospel you read, it may be because of some of the stuff that Jesus has done, or it may be because of the disciples who have gone out and done some ministry as well, and they're like, wow, like even these guys can do some stuff. So a large crowd gathers. It's getting late, the crowd are hungry, and let's be honest, the disciples do what we would all do. If they would come and they would be like, it's getting late, Jesus. Like these people, you've got to let them go home and get some food. They're not going to be able to get food otherwise. It's like when you come to the end of church, for example, and church is still going on. Like most people will come to the front and just be like to whoever's leading, or the pastors or elders of the church, they'd be like, we need to finish because like it's getting on for like nearly 1 o'clock now. People need to go home and have their lunch, and everyone would be like, yeah, okay, yeah, it's fine. But Jesus doesn't give them the, yeah, okay, yeah, that's fine. Firstly, it says Jesus has had compassion on this group of people, and it's always compassion that drives us to action. Compassion drives us to be bold and be courageous. And Jesus has this compassion on the crowd even before his disciples come to him. And I love the phrase, Matthew 14:16, where the disciples are like, just before that, they go, so let them go away to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And I imagine at that moment, the disciples are like, what? Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to give them something to eat? Like, I don't understand how we can give them something to eat. Imagine them just like looking at each other again. How? How are we going to do this? Like, this isn't going to work. Jesus, you don't understand. Yes, there were like people there it says 5,000 men, like people who are more intelligent and maybe more biblically understanding than I am say there's probably between 15 and 20,000 people there. It's like a football crowd. And Jesus just looks at them and says, you give them something to eat. I love it in John, because John writes it slightly differently, but it tells the same story. Like, I don't want you necessarily to turn to it, but I just want to read to you just one line that Jesus gives in John, because it always makes me laugh. Basically, Philip, for John, seems to be one of the main characters. And he, in John chapter 6, Philip says, where shall we go and buy bread for all these people to eat? No, Jesus says, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He's looking at Philip at the time, turns to Philip when Jesus saw the large crowd coming towards him, and Jesus looks at Philip and says, where are you going to buy bread for all these people, Philip? And Philip at that moment has been like, I don't know. He just must have cracked at that moment, being like, I don't know. I think John puts it in there because he was like, Philip must have been like, yeah, and he's struggling at that moment. And just been like, I don't know. How are we going to sort this out? And in the story, we learn that all they have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. And in John, we find out that that's just a packed lunch of a boy. He's the only one, by the way, that's brought a packed lunch. You're like idiots, the rest of them. But like this kid's got his packed lunch. He's got his loaves and his fish, which, by the way, 5 loaves of bread for a kid's packed lunch. It's like he must have been chubs. But anyway, so he has this lunch. And I heard someone recently, well, I didn't hear them talking about it, but they mentioned it to me. And they said, oh, yeah, isn't Feeding the 5,000 a great Bible story? It's all about sharing. And I was like, is it? And they were like, yeah, isn't it great that it's all about sharing? That they didn't have much food, but they broke it up so that everyone had some still. And I was like, I'm sorry, we just need to look at the facts again for a moment. 5 loaves, 2 fish, 15,000 people. How small an amount do you have to take from a loaf to be like, I'm satisfied now? I mean, it doesn't make sense. The number of bread and fish don't satisfy that amount of people. Jesus performs a miracle. And in John chapter 6, verse 7, Philip, again, once he's worked out, because he seems to be the mathematician in some way, he's like, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed these people. He later says, it's 8 months' wages to feed this amount of people. Now, if you look at that in modern day, I don't really know what the average yearly wage in like North Devon is, but let's think 8 months' wages is probably between, I don't know, 8 and 12,000 pounds maybe. Philip is saying, we don't have 12,000 pounds, Jesus. Like, did you notice that we have basically nothing? But God performs this miracle. And with God, he performs this miracle. But the key is, what the people had, they had to give it to him. What the guys had, what the little boy had, what the 15,000 people had, they had to offer it to Jesus first for him to do the miracle. If they hadn't offered him the lunch, Jesus might not have done the miracle. Boys, you can come forward, by the way. You don't need to sit back there. Come forward and sit with us. It's one of those things where it's like, 15,000 people and bread and fish, and Jesus performs this miracle, but what we have in our hands had to be offered to Jesus first. If they didn't offer what they had in their hands to Jesus, no miracle. If they didn't give what they already had to Jesus, Jesus got nothing even there to work with. I'm not saying Jesus, I don't know, he might have just, manna might have rained down like the old days, or I don't know, he may have just zapped a deer or something. I don't know how he would have done it, but maybe he would have supplied anyway. But the fact is that they had to give what was already in their hands for the miracle to happen. So the question is for you, what have you got in your hands? Is it money? Some of you are like, no, it's not, Paul. I don't mean literally, but you know what I mean. By the way, for you guys, if you have any money in a bank account, you are in the top 2% of the richest people in the planet. Feel good about yourselves, or maybe not, as the case may be. What else you got in your hands? Maybe a gift. Maybe God's blessed you with a gift. Maybe he's given you a talent or a skill in some way. Maybe he's given you energy or time. God's like, offer it to me. I can work a miracle through that. With this, God can work a miracle, but you've got to offer it to him first. One of the weird things is when people pray, quite often I say to people when they're praying for something, sometimes the answer to your prayer is you. And people are always thrown by this because they're like, no, it's not, Paul. But I need to explain it. Because sometimes we have what the answer to our prayer is. For example, there's a famine at some place in the world and you see it on TV, and maybe you offer a prayer, God, would you change that situation? And God's like, have you got any money? Like, could you give some? What you've got in your hands can change a situation. For sometimes maybe it's like, oh God, I've got a friend who I really want to come to know Jesus. And yeah, great, we've got to pray about that. But God might also be saying back to you, cool, do you know the gospel? They're your friend. Do you want to share it with them? Then I can work. Then I will work. It might be, you know someone that's ill or has an injury in some way that isn't well. And you're like, it's bad. And God might be like, go and pray for him. Next time you see him, you could go and pray for him. It might be that you're just like, there's always these volunteers. We need more volunteers to do some of the stuff that God is asking us to do. And you're just like, it's disgraceful. And God might be like, you've got time. You've got some energy. And we need to understand that it isn't about how good we are. And it isn't about how great we are. Because Philip calculates what it would take to feed all of these people. And in other words, he's saying, man can't do this. We don't have enough money. There's no way we can do this. We need God's power. And it's almost echoing what Zechariah says in chapter 4, verse 6 in the Old Testament, where it's not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. You don't need to struggle with your might and your power. God's like, let my spirit come and work in and through you. But when you offer your skill, when you offer your talent, your time, your energy to God, he's like, I will work by my spirit in you and through you. I love this story. For one of the reasons I love it is because Jesus didn't just meet the need of the people, he surpasses their need. And that is what our God is always like. God doesn't just meet our needs very often, he so often surpasses it. And you see, God, as I mentioned just when I was praying before, God doesn't just forgive us. Because you'll be like, that's what I need, forgiveness, God. He doesn't just forgive us. He says, no, now you're in a relationship with me, and I also clothe you with my righteousness. It's the God that does immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine. And I love also about this miracle, the disciples were involved. They had to do this groundwork. They had to organize the people. It says in some of the other gospel accounts that they had to get these 15,000 people sat into groups of 50 and 100. And that must have been mind-blowingly difficult. I know how hard it is to get some of you stood in a circle for a game sometimes. That sometimes takes about 5 minutes. I don't know how they separated everyone up right. 50 there, 50 there. Because it's going to take a while, but they all got involved and did the groundwork. They also take the bread and the fish to the people. And they obey Jesus. And it's not easy to obey him in this circumstance, I would suggest. Now, I don't know what physically happened. I don't know how to imagine what happens, but Jesus holds the bread and the fish aloft and he thanks God for them. And then he divides it up into 12 baskets and is like, now you take it to the people. Now, I don't know when he prays, if there and then it's like that, just sort of like multiplies. I don't know how it works. Or I don't know if as they were taking it, it was enough. But I can also imagine a disciple walking off with some bread in a basket, being like, okay, I can feed that 50 people, maybe that 50, but not the 50 after that, and not the 50 after that. And I mean, he's done a miracle. That's great. He's multiplied this to be a lot more. But there are a lot of people here. They have to obey and they carry out Jesus' instructions. I don't know, if I was one of the disciples, I'd probably be walking off being like, I mean, he's done good. Still not enough though, is it? I don't know if you can carry in a basket enough bread and fish to feed that amount of people. So I suspect that along the way, as they were giving the bread and fish out, they like gave some to someone, and then they're like, thank you. They looked back in their basket and there was more. Like, I'd love that to be the case. They're just like, hang on, I thought I just took that out. Hang on, let me give you that again. Whoa, there's some more. I don't know how this is happening. And they just continue on this way. But actually, as they did that, they had to continue to trust Jesus along the way. You know, just think about that they had to keep trusting that he would provide at every moment. And guys, that's the same for us. We need to continue to trust God every step of the way. You know, we can be involved in God doing amazing miracles. God wants us to be involved. And the disciples also went and picked up 12 basketfuls of leftovers, which I assume every one of the disciples went out and collected leftovers. But we've got to offer ourselves to God and say, God, would you use me? God, would you take what I have and would you use it for your glory? I want to obey you and I want to trust you. You are good, you are faithful, and you can do immeasurably more. And I love it that God shatters pint-sized expectations. And he blows our mind quite often with how great and how good he is. But we need to learn to give to him what we hold close. You see, when we offer our lives sacrificially to God, it means letting go of stuff. Because to give it to God means you've got to let it go. Now, if you're anything like me, letting go of stuff isn't necessarily easy. I'm a bit of a hoarder in some ways. I'm not like one of those people you see on TV. I didn't come in my house and there's like cat feces all over the place or anything like that. But actually, there might be, but that's not my fault. That's the cat's fault. But so you have like this situation where you're like, it's very difficult to give up what I like or what is mine. So chocolate is one of those big examples, isn't it? For example, people come around your house. You've got a bar of chocolate in your room and you love chocolate. What do? Do you be like, I don't want to offer it to you. Just going to keep it. It's mine. That's the conversation that goes on in my head. I'm just like, I could give them some chocolate. I don't want to. It's my chocolate. It's mine, my precious. And then you kind of keep it for yourself. And sometimes, even if you get to a stage where you're just like, I need to offer it to them. You offer it to them, but at that time you're like, please don't take any. Please don't. Like, you don't say it out loud, obviously, like, please don't take any of this, because then you know they will. But in your mind, when you offer, you're like, hey, does anyone want any chocolate? And you're like, please, they all say no. And if someone does say no, you're like, yes, I love that. And then you move on to the next one. But we've got to let go of what we have to allow God to use it. If we offer it, we've got to let go. And that is maybe things like our time. That may be things like our talents or our energy or our money. And God uses these ordinary things to do extraordinary stuff. It's like Romans 12 verse 1 says that we need to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. That's everything that we are. We need to offer as a living sacrifice, a whole life to God. And that's our true and proper worship. And I want to encourage you to never believe that your resources, what you have, is too little to serve God. What you have been given, you've been given for a reason. God delights in taking humble, insignificant people and using them for his glory. You just need to read the Bible and you see that. These insignificant people, that not a lot is really going for them. But when they offer their whole lives to God and say, God, would you use me? God uses them in an amazingly powerful way. I love 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27. It says, instead, God chose things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose the things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. Question tonight is really simple. What have you got in your hands? Is it money? Is it a gift, a talent, energy, time, skill? Fill in the blank. What have you got in your hands? You know, maybe you're good at a sport and you play the sport and God's like, I want you to offer the gift, the talent that I've given you to me. Not that I will then multiply it and make you the best footballer in the world. I mean, he might, but it's not necessarily the case. But actually, so he's like, offer it to me. I can use you with your teammates. Maybe it's art, and you've got a gift in that. God's like, I can use that. I can definitely use that. Maybe it's music, and I'm not saying it's just for church in A2J, but in any way, the songs that you write, the people that you mix with, God's like, I can use that. Maybe it's that you're a good listener. God's like, I can definitely use that. Maybe you're good with kids. Oh, good luck to you. But God can use that. And maybe, I don't know, maybe your thing's hair braiding. I don't know a lot about hair braiding. But then, I don't know. And I'm not saying, by the way, that as you're braiding someone's hair, you're just looking at them going, you know what your hair reminds me of? Samson. And then you start telling them about the Bible. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you can honor God in the way that you work. You can offer that skill to God. God can open up opportunities for you to use it for his glory. And whenever you get praised for the way that you have done something, or the skill that you have, or the talent that you have, you can reflect that praise and that glory back to God to say, actually, it's all about him. He gave me the gift and talent in the first place. It's all for him. It's all about him. And I want to encourage you. Are you prepared to offer what is in your hands to God? To let go of it, to let go of your life, to let go of your future to God, and allow God to use it to bring about a miracle. Because maybe you have the answer to a prayer in your hands. Maybe it's your prayer that you have prayed at some point. Maybe it's someone else's prayer, and God is just working things together. You know, God's Spirit, plus with his power, plus what he has given you, can bring about miracles, and he surpasses our needs. We just need to obey him. We need to trust him. Do the groundwork. Get involved in what God is doing, and God performs a miracle through your life.